Hello, I'm Tom Ferguson, and welcome to The Fundamental Molecule. This show explores the intersection of water, technology, and entrepreneurship. Each week, I interview innovators, experts, entrepreneurs, and investors in the world of water, helping us understand where this trillion-dollar industry is headed. These are the stories of the people building the future of the world's most valuable and fundamental resource.
Disclaimer. Tom Ferguson is the managing partner of Virgin Island Ventures. All opinions expressed by Tom and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Virgin Island Ventures. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be viewed as investment advice or relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.
The world's biggest supply chains, cocoa, coffee, palm, soy, timber, beef, rubber, all begin in the same place. A farm, often a smallholder, almost always invisible to the companies that depend on it. That first mile is where deforestation happens, where emissions accrue, and where water stress bites hardest. And until recently, nobody could give large companies an ability to understand what was and could be going on at the foundations of their supply chains. Jinal Surti is changing that. After building his career at the forefront of crypto with Egnyte, Ripple, and Menai, Jinal co-founded Epoch in London in 2023 to generate location-linked intelligence, deforestation status, emissions, water stress, of course, biodiversity risk, compliance, for every farm, plantation, and processing facility feeding global commodity supply chains. It's been such a thrill to work with him on a project of this magnitude. And as you will hear, he thinks as clearly about company creation, value defensibility, and the practical implications and opportunities of AI as anyone I have met. Please enjoy my conversation with Jinal Surti. Jinal, how nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Tom.
You are in London. My voice is from London, but you are actually there. Everything going okay? Do you feel like you're in an oven, or what's going on?
There is a heat wave. This is the third of the season, and it's extended to 2 weeks.
It makes the people who kind of planted like vines in Kent suddenly looking like they are.
I mean, that's the next champagne, is what I hear.
That is the next champagne. I want to take you first to an explanation of the background of what you're building. And the best place to start, I think, is why do supply chains matter? What is it that drew you to this? Why are you choosing to focus on that specific area of the economy?
I've always found supply chains to be fascinating. So before Epoch, I was in the payment space, and particularly in cross-border payments, which of course, mirrors the goods flows. So you have goods going one way, payments going the other way. And even there, when we talk to customers, they were always looking for more data. They were hungry for more data, more visibility on the transaction, more visibility on the goods, more visibility on suppliers. And this was 10 years ago. We, as the industry, has come a long way, both from a regulatory perspective, but also from a risk perspective. And so, the more data that you have, the more you're able to manage your exposure as a company. And that has certainly become more and more true now. This is sort of a continuation of that whole journey where we sort of looked at it from a payments perspective, enabling those cross-border transactions and tying more data elements to it. But this data essentially underpins how a business thinks about its operations, which some would argue it's the most critical component of its operations, which is the upstream part of the supply chain, which is the procurement and production of goods and all the risks associated with it and all the requirements associated with it and so on. The second part of this also is coming from an impact standpoint. So both my co-founder and I were also looking at this from an impact perspective. And the more we thought about it, the more we realized, A, the way to drive impact is through a for-profit model, and B, through essentially the corporate supply chains, because cleaning up corporate supply chains is the biggest driver that we have, not just for climate, but for human rights, for biodiversity, for water, for income inequality, etc. The biggest challenge there is how do you diagnose where the problems are and how you get visibility into something that just has been so opaque and ephemeral because these supply chains evolve and change all the time. So I think both from like an intellectual curiosity on data on these supply chains, but also the ability to kind of drive impact. This is, corporate supply chains and intersection of that and the data analysis has always been kind of top of mind for me. And that's in a very kind of broad sense what led me to this.
So I think it's really important. I wanted to kind of spend a little bit of time on the background, but I realized contextually it's actually really important that you explain exactly what Epoch does. So why don't you just walk us in through precisely the kind of the architecture you're setting up and the value proposition that you're providing kind of into your customers, because it's actually the most valuable piece of context.
Yes. So Epoch produces first mile data. So what we actually do is we locate assets and facilities in corporate supply chains. We analyze what's happening at those facilities. We generate evidence and data sets in a very, very scalable way. So this is not one of those like send supplier surveys and, have them self-report on these things. Like what can be observed, what can be collected on the suppliers in a highly scalable way so that corporates can satisfy compliance requirements. So think EU deforestation regulation. Is there deforestation in my supply chain? B, corporates can manage risks better. So things like fire risk, flood risk, natural hazards. How could they, or how vulnerable are these assets in my supply chains around these risks? And third, for reporting, there are 56 global frameworks that require data on the first mile of these supply chains, whether it's CSRD, SRS, whether it's GSI, GRI, there's ISSB, there's all these wonderful acronyms, there's TNFD, and all these reporting frameworks that corporates have to deal with, which they all ask for the same type of information, which is what's actually happening.
Huge amount of crossover.
Exactly. And so we produce data for that. And one slight nuance to what we do is we don't typically sell directly to customers. We actually integrate our data into platforms that corporates use to manage their supply chains. So we actually have a much, much further reach than any single company in this space because we are platform agnostic and we serve and we provide data to customers that may use different platforms for different things. So we're platform agnostic in a way.
And then what do the corporates do with this data? I mean, so you're obviously going through the platforms in order for them to have access to it. But I think it's really important to take it through to kind of the so what changes in the corporate's life. It sounds like there's obviously a degree of convenience there because of all of the various reporting platforms, but there's obviously significant operational inferences and various actions that they can take. Can you kind of just elucidate exactly what that looks like? What changes in the corporate's life as a result of the data you can provide them scalably?
That depends on the use case. So if the use case is compliance, we generate data and reporting packages to file, your EUDR due diligence statement, for example. If it's risk management, you are generating signals that might indicate risk. And so then corporates actually take those risk signals, they combine it with other risk signals, and they will then generate a risk profile for different parts of their supply chains. And then for reporting, it's essentially giving evidence sets and databases for corporates to put into their disclosures, their annual TNFD disclosures, their annual ISSB disclosures, their GRI disclosures, and so on. Most importantly, I think what comes on the back of this is it gives corporates a very clear evidence-based insight into what's actually happening in their supply chains. And that becomes the driver for change because, for example, we work with a very large auto OEM. Now they have a lot of rubber in their supply chain. They may find that there are 600 suppliers that they're exposed to. Out of the 600, there are really 30 that, there are problems at. Maybe there's forced labor, maybe there's deforestation or whatever the case might be. And so it automatically focuses their efforts into saying, I don't have to worry about the 540, but the 60 that really have these issues, I need to do something about fixing it. So this level of visibility at global scale can very, very quickly accelerate action that drive change. And to be fair, corporates want to do this. They just have been paralyzed on the measurement phase and on the data collection phase. And so we sort of accelerate that to a point where it just, okay, well, what next happens very, very quickly.
Can you spend some more time there? Tell us how this was done before, because I think it's illuminating. I'm really interested in the bridge between the observation of how it was done before and then obviously your understanding of the importance of the supply chain as a result of your payments experience. But exactly how did this kind of crystallize? How did this idea grab you? But just start with how this was done before.
There were three, and today, by the way, this is also happening today. There are three main ways in which corporates really obtain information in what's happening in their supply chains. The first is they look for certification data, which I don't need to tell you how much that is total BS.
You actually say more.
Well, just because a product is certified by some certification body doesn't really evidence any difference. And you may buy something with FSC certificate on it, and it could still come from old forest, deforested, supply base, or you could have one of these like marine certification logos on your can of tuna, and it would say dolphin free or dolphin safe or whatever. And you actually look at the reality and it's not.
How is that allowed? Because it's a really interesting one, right? Because like a normal person who is trying to be a conscientious consumer is going into Sainsbury's or whatever and is looking for the can of tuna or the thing or the whatever, or shopping on Wayfair and want to make sure that the wood's coming from it. But if these labels are kind of untrustworthy, it's amazing to me that they've stuck around. Or is there something psychologically that you think is worth kind of highlighting about that? If these bullshit, like,
well, it's changing in a few ways. One, there's anti-greenwashing laws that now regulators are starting to put into place. Second, I think the consumer trust in these labels has also gone away. And third, some of these regulations explicitly call out that labels and certifications just can't be enough. You have to show the data. And so in many ways, we're sort of moving beyond the certification because they just have been abused so much. And I think it's not because it was malicious intent or whatever, but it's just the incentives are backwards. These certification bodies get paid by who they certify. Why wouldn't you have as big of a customer base as possible? And if your constituent or your customer is doing something wrong, you can say you're fixing it, but you have no timeline to actually get it fixed, because the sooner you get it fixed, the sooner you confront it, then you have to make the call on whether or not to keep them as a customer or a constituent or not. So anyways, there's lots of problems with certifications. When we go to the supermarket, we these labels, we frankly totally ignore them because there's no meaning to most of them. For corporates, they have been relying on that. They still do, except for some of these regulations where they basically say an RSPO certificate or an FSC certificate doesn't mean anything. So you would have to do this work regardless of what you have. So A, they don't mean anything anymore for regulatory purposes. The second way they've done this is by asking the suppliers. These are supplier questionnaires. You send these 80 question questionnaire to a supplier and ask them to basically write paragraphs about how good they are. And obviously no supplier is
can only imagine how reliable that is.
Yeah, no supplier is actually going to say, oh yeah, we did have this issue and we haven't quite figured out how to fix it. Obviously self-reported questionnaires, by the way, they're also a huge pain point for suppliers because some of these suppliers get multiple of these questionnaires, even by the same customer. So it's unbelievable how annoying this whole process is. And the third is audits. So for companies that are very heavily reliant on certain commodities or certain products, they send auditors. And this is a huge industry in itself, making billions of dollars to do these site visits and audits. The challenge, and I'm not saying that's not good, that's good, except it only gives you visibility into a subset of what's actually happening. You're getting a sampled version of what's happening. You're never getting the big picture, and it's extremely expensive. So this is how companies today and in the past used to actually rely on these three kind of very outdated and scalable methods to understand what's happening in their supply chain. Two things changed. First, the advent of AI. You're now able to process large unstructured sets of data in meaningful ways, in bespoke research kind of workflows at global scale. And secondly, geospatial AI in particular, which is intelligence about what's happening physically, has made visual analysis, or not just visual analysis, but location-based analysis, extremely efficient and cost-effective. What that means is now I can find things faster. If somebody told me, find all the rubber factories in Cambodia, we could do that within minutes. I can analyze things faster. So I can then say, okay, well, I found this rubber factory. show me all the rubber that's growing around it. I can find that very quickly. Third is I can analyze metrics very, very efficiently. So now I can say, okay, show me how that land has changed over time. Show me about the transpiration data. I can do water modeling, for example, a lot faster. So I can do all these things at a price point that makes it viable for a corporate to process thousands of these suppliers for their entire supply chains. And some of these techniques had started getting introduced maybe 5 years ago, but they were cost prohibitive. Like analyzing one small supplier or supply base would have cost you $100,000. We could do it for a few hundred. Both of those things basically made it possible. This technology made it possible to create this global intelligence layer that can scale significantly and actually be useful at a price point that makes sense for these corporates to get a comprehensive picture of what's happening in their supply chain.
Just on the water side of things, I mean, you've done some really interesting work in water. And obviously, the reason that we wanted to work with you is that we've always held a belief. There have been various sort of platforms for water risk and all the rest of it, but we're big believers that people just don't want to remember another password, right? I mean, password managers and all the rest of it. But it's not just a password. It's just, oh, now I'm hanging out on another platform. We really thought this was going to get sold by a one-stop shop. We wanted to be, part of something that we thought had a kind of a serious lead within it. That is fascinating and super helpful context. So can you talk to us a little bit about the work you've done in water? You've had some really, really fascinating work with WWF. And actually, your last investor update, you said that one of the most requested side of things is units measure, or the things to measure is the water side of things, which we think is instructive. For us, it's not surprising, but it is instructive. How have you found the intersection with the water side of things? Because historically, data on water is very bad.
Couple of things. So several of these global frameworks, whether it's for risk or for regulations, require data on water. So think, CSRD, ESRS, E3, I believe, is water related data, ISSB, GRI. I'm forgetting the acronym, but there's a financial services specific one that requires banks to do stress tests. And a big part of that is climate related, and a big part of that is water. So water is actually very topical because companies are already seeing the impact of water issues in their supply bases, but also it's increasingly being for by the financial community and by the regulators to force companies to think about what's actually happening on the water side of things. So if you're an ag and commodity producer, that's pretty obvious with water. And by the way, it's not just lack of water, it's also flood and landslides and ability to, there's
Any source of business interruption, right?
Yeah, exactly. When you look at ag and forestry commodities, it's so critical to how they produce that raw material. And there you are looking for more signs of like drought resistance, heat stress, water stress. We actually can also do something that we call overall water budget in the watershed. So look at all the inputs and outputs of water within that supply shed and identify whether that's trending up or down, or i.e. is that site becoming more vulnerable, less vulnerable, and so on. But you can broaden beyond ag and forestry commodities because we were working with a pharmaceutical company, and apparently GLP-1 manufacturing sites require a ton of water. Semiconductor plants require a ton of water. Data centers require a ton of water. And water actually comes as a risk in the form of electricity prices in many jurisdictions because they affect the grid if you're reliant on hydro. And so this notion of water risk, which is a huge bucket, affects pretty much every single supply chain in a meaningful way. And we still don't have a very good sense of doing robust, scalable analyses for all these production sites in a globally consistent way. That's kind of the work that we're doing with water. I'll give you another statistic. So there are 56 global frameworks, as I mentioned before, that are regulations or disclosure requirements across 6 global jurisdictions. We've only looked at 6, but there could be more. Things like UDR, CSRD, ISSB, GRI, etc. So if you're a global company, you have 56 frameworks to deal with. These 56 frameworks require 863 individual disclosure points. So these are questions you need to answer or data points you need to disclose and so on.
Oh my God.
But out of the 863, they all boil down to only 88 data primitives, and water-related data sets are 49 of those disclosure points and 6 data primitives, and they impact 7 of these global frameworks. And so if you remove water, some of the biggest frameworks you can't disclose data on or you can't comply with. So it is a necessary component to how corporates look at the space.
So in terms of kind of getting this ground truth data, like just walk us through in really kind of layman's terms, like how is it that you are harvesting this intelligence on literally millions of farms across the world, essentially in more or less, well, certainly in more real time than giving someone an unnecessarily long and complicated questionnaire where you have a questionable response rate to it. So it might as well be real time. How is it that you are, firstly, getting the data, and secondly, making sure it's reliable, and then thirdly, making sure it's up to date? Just give us an idea of that stack and how you thought about designing it.
Let's start with what the customer has. So the customer has, in many cases, a list of their tier one suppliers. You look at an OEM, here are the suppliers I deal with. Sometimes they have multi-tier visibility, but most of the times they don't. So they don't know who their suppliers source from and so on and so forth. We work with our partners sometimes to also provide that multi-tier visibility. So we'll start with the tier one suppliers, we'll get to the end of the chain and say, okay, here are the locations or the factories where things are made. We're starting to help our partners with this as well, because we now have ability to help construct some of that from the ground up, because we have models that will detect the types of facilities and the types of regions, because we've seen our models have enough context to be like, this is what rubber factories look like in Cambodia versus Ivory Coast. We can help pinpoint and locate these facilities. So there's a very kind of important element of locating and validating the locations of these suppliers, because business records will give you an address that may be a sales office or head office in downtown somewhere, but that's not where your risks lie. Your risks lie at the production site and the production facility. So first you have to locate these assets. And there we use a lot of embeddings. This is the first sort of jargon that I'm going to use here. Embeddings are these very dense data sets that are in raster form. So basically what these geospatial AI models do is they embed so much contextual information in every single pixel. And they'll say, this pixel now has 64 variables, and these variables by themselves don't mean anything. But if you feed it into the model and you say, this is what a rubber factory looks like, then the model is able to find other rubber factories that look like that.
It's located, yes.
That's basically what embeddings are. So we leverage a lot of embeddings for facility identification. We'll then leverage embeddings for crop detection classification. We'll look for, we can even use embeddings for natural hazard prediction. So we ran a study to say, if we just train the model on past flood data, can we identify the most vulnerable watersheds? And it turns out we did it for 2025. We were right 80% of the time, because we were able to say, okay, well, these look like they will get hit. And in 2025, they did get hit. So you can use embeddings for a lot of these different cases, but you need the context. You need to give the model an idea of what certain things look like and what to look for and so on. From a data production standpoint, you have located assets, you have analyzed things around the assets, and you're producing that data. And there are two major components to that process. The first is good geospatial AI models, and there's no moat in that. There are 6 or 7 geospatial AI model providers. Google's one of them. But the more important part is actually providing the context for these models. So if you don't tell the model what something is, it will not know what to look for. And so that's where the more customers you serve, the more context you generate, which is how you leverage these models for producing useful information for your purposes. So essentially what we do is we complete the picture for our customers and our partners, where we say, okay, you have some information about your supply chain. Let us now pull in all these different data sources, geospatial, but also kind of a lot of things in the public domain, like import-export records and so on. You can pull that in to say, this is what your supply chain looks like, and here's what's actually happening in that first mile. And all of that depends on essentially these two things, the model and the context.
You brought up the M word, which is mode. So we're in a really, it's such a fascinating time, whether Mr. Michael Porter or Hamilton Helmer, 5 forces, 7 powers, whatever you want to be using, is that they've been updated and are being updated in real time. So there's sort of the basis of competitive strategy. But you think as clearly about the new model of competitive strategy as anybody that we work with. I mean, I don't want you to sort of give away any kind of secret sauce or whatever it is. So you can keep it high level or generalities or whatever it might be. But can you just walk us through how you've thought about making sure that Epoch is buying the right to sustainably make excess profit, which is sort of the whole ball of all of this? Like, how have you thought about making yourself strong?
It's such an interesting thing because the way you built a business 2 years ago, 3 years ago, was totally different than the way you think about building a business, and building a sustainable moat obviously has totally changed. Let's start with where the moats aren't there. So I think number one, I think tech. If somebody says we're the only ones who can build this tech, there's no moat there. We have some seriously cool tech and seriously cool data pipelines that does pretty serious analyses on demand. But over time, and right now AI can't do it, but over time, I'd expect AI to do this very easily. So maybe not in the next 1 to 2 years, but in the next 5 to 10 years. So we do have a kind of a window, but the tech sort of moat is going away. And I don't think anyone will have any serious tech moat left. I mean, you can kind of take that logic further and start thinking about, well, what does it mean for these big model companies, which is a totally different, conversation altogether.
Yeah. One I quite like to get into, but let's
Yeah.
say this side.
So no moat in tech. There's no moat in workflows and interfaces. So design was sort of hailed as the magic thing in Silicon Valley. It's going away as a moat very quickly because not only can you design things faster, you can iterate faster, and most importantly, your customers can build better workflows than you can. If you give them access to a well-organized backend, they will actually build a better workflow because it will be customized for them and for their and you can do this with Claude now. You can say, well, show me this dashboard that does this. And oh no, I don't want this here and I want this here. And you don't need to be a software engineer. You can be an individual user and it will, you'll be able to generate your own workflows. The third, this is arguable, but I think customer relationships at a very high level or some subset of customer relationships, most companies and customers multi-home, so they'll move around, they'll do best of breed for everything, although that's now starting to get consolidated into kind of more of this like super app strategy for most customers. But if you're trying to build a company with any of these moats, you need to really seriously think about what it actually is. The way we think about the moat is in two ways. One is the data and context moat. So we constantly think about, do we have the biggest data moat in the space? Do we have the biggest context for these models in the space? And that means we have the largest training data set, we have the largest contextual information, because access to foundational models is democratized. Anyone can have access to alpha earth embeddings or Tesseract or Clay or whatever. What really wins is context. And so the more customers you serve, the more context you have, and the more context you can use to utilize those models and make your product better. So if your models understand how things work in as many instances as possible, you just have a better product. So this is me trying to be obscure, but without giving away.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
What we actually kind of build context, but at a very high level, think about the more customers you serve, the more things you've seen, the more things your models see. And so they just get more intelligent over time. And you need a process to build that intelligence over time. So that's the data and context mode. The second, I think, is this network mode, which is, through our partnerships today, our data is accessible to more than 24,000 corporates. We expect this number to grow to 100,000 corporates. And that's 100,000 corporates that are downstream buyers in supply chains. So these are companies that buy goods and services that we're giving them visibility on their suppliers. And so we're kind of serving them with intelligence and visibility into their supply chains. On the other side, we maintain an enriched and geographically located, validated list of suppliers and their assets. So this is not just, hey, we have an address from the business registry. We've looked at this building, we validated it is actually a factory of doing what it does and makes X. And this is valuable to buyers because This helps us locate those suppliers much faster, and vice versa for suppliers. Having this like access and dissemination ability for these 24,000 corporates, it's a way to disseminate information to the largest set of downstream, operators. And that's super valuable because then you don't have to fill out 20 customer surveys and update everyone on the same thing. You have the ability to push that information out that is then available to corporates that's platform agnostic. So in that case, distribution matters, connectivity matters. And that we think is a sustainable moat because you now have a network of entities. Either they need information or they need to interact with the other, or they benefit from the information from the other side. And the more you build that network, the bigger that moat becomes. And that's very hard to disrupt from an AI standpoint because you're not going to build that connectivity just with software. You're going to have that interaction to build that connectivity.
Yeah, and it's a very, very, very powerful engine, but it's such an extraordinary statement, isn't it? That any kind of tech lead, the way we put it is that you have to act now as if your tech lead, whoever you are, essentially, has already disappeared. What else is it that can make you difficult to dislodge, or what other value can you provide? How can you be careful with your customers to minimize the likelihood that existing customers are going to move on or move across? But obviously maximize the likelihood that the marginal customer is going to choose you. It's so interesting. And it's so in flux. And to wit, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about how you are treating AI internally? You guys are very sophisticated in your use of it. Obviously, it's kind of at the core of your product, but also kind of managerially, you had some really interesting observations at our founder forum about how fast everything was moving. So can you just sort of take a second to reflect on kind of the state of AI, both obviously for your product, but also internally at the company? Where are we? Where is this going? How are you, because the only sort of certainty is change, right? So how are you setting yourself up to be able to kind of deal with that?
First of all, I think it's a super exciting time to build a company because even though there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of like anxiety in the world, you just have so many of these tools that you can kind of question every single notion that has been out there as like the right way to do things. So it's totally different. At a high level, the teams are smaller. You're able to get much more done. You're able to ship much faster. Like last year, I think you saw it in our financials. Like we were a very, very small company and we had 2 out of 4 quarters that we were profitable in. And so it allows you to basically raise because you want to invest in growth and not because you want to survive, even as a very, very small company. So you can bootstrap from the ground up, which many companies do. But I think the key unlock is like being able to do things that were just not possible before. I started my career in product marketing, and product marketing is all about, do you understand the customer and are you able to communicate to the customer the core value proposition of the product, and are you able to basically channel this product in a way that makes the friction to purchase that product as low as possible. Traditional product marketing, you kind of have to just talk to a bunch of customers and you're only one person in a big company and you have to distill all this information from everywhere. You're sort of doing this fuzzy analysis in your head, being like, well, this customer said this and this other customer said this, and I think the answer is this, and so on. And so one of the first things that we did is we basically built this very, very customer centric product development and marketing process. And so every external call is recorded and transcribed, and it goes into this repository. And we actually use AI to analyze that periodically to figure out what the customer is actually saying, what they actually want, what their actual pain points are as spoken by them and not what we think it is. And then you can utilize that for lots of information. You can kind of cross-reference against our strategy. You can cross-reference against your product roadmap. You can cross-reference against your content and your materials and your segmentation, your profiles and the job to be done. And all these things you can kind of build off of this like customer insight. And that can now be driven by AI because it's all fuzzy. It's words that are spoken. Now AI basically allows you to analyze hundreds and millions of these words into something that's usable, which is, this is what your market is telling you. The other thing is product iteration loops are so much faster. And so your shipping capability is really fast. So I remember just 3 weeks ago, this is fresh in my mind because I just dealt with it a few hours ago. We talked to a global consultancy and they asked a specific question. They're like, our biggest problem is X. Can you solve X? At the time, I went to the transcript and I was like, no, we don't do that today. And we sort of like left it at that. And I think they were a little disappointed because that's where they really needed the help. In the meantime, we sort of also learned the same from a bunch of other customers. And we were able to actually get something that's 80% there out already. And so today, 3 weeks later, they send us some test data and they're like, let's like do a small pilot. And I'm going back to the transcript and I'm like, oh, the thing that I told them we're not able to do, which was their bigger problem, we're now actually able to do. This totally changed in 3 weeks. What I'm actually finding is sometimes product videos that we record 3 weeks ago become embarrassing because I'm like, oh my God, this is so bad. We've improved so much in the past 3 weeks. Like, I think this like whole thing about product development cycles being multi-month, multi-quarter, multi-year is just like totally ridiculous. You are so agile in the way you iterate and able to give the market what they want.
And the only way to maintain that is by keep doing it, because you have to make the assumption that anybody who's coming up after you is going to be as agile as possible. So maintaining that within your team as you get bigger is now kind of a total imperative. It seems to me that there are a couple of tensions here. One is that as you scale, historically, organizations have calcified. But given how everything is kind of under threat all the time now from insurgents, how do you think about avoiding that calcification? You're still early, you're not running into it yet, but have you given any thought to what that might look like?
You're right. Like, we're early in that we don't have this calcification problem. Like, even if I look at companies that were started 6 years ago, 5, 6 years ago, they have an organization that I don't think they need to do what they want to do. But I don't think it's as easy for them to now restructure the whole thing. And so we're very, very careful in like how we organize and build that structure internally, because that thing becomes the hardest to undo. And I know we will need to change that. Like, and so I think weirdly in a way, like with AI, you want to be very, very thoughtful about how you grow and who you hire, because you want people who have a very different skill set than your traditional hires that you're looking for. You almost want people who can delegate the best and manage the best, because that's what prompting really is, rather than somebody who's really, really good at doing one thing. Like, I would avoid someone like that at all costs who can just do one really, really good thing. But there are exceptions, obviously, for sales, partnerships, kind of human centric functions. You probably need to think about this differently, but things like marketing, product development, all these functions, you kind of need, even all the G&A like functions, you kind of need that managerial mindset, that delegative mindset.
I told you this was going to happen. I wanted this conversation to go on well, much longer than we unfortunately have time for. Before we get to our closing question, I've got one thing I really, really wanted to ask you, which is that you came from a much further away from, I mean, water, but the overall sustainability question. Obviously, this is allied to the payments world, and so there's a more subtle through line there. But you spent a good amount of time in the crypto world doing serious work for serious companies, including being part of the founder team of a crypto investor and market maker. What are your reflections on the implications of the development of crypto? Because it's gone very quiet relative to AI, but there are actually really interesting interlinkages. And it's gone very quiet, but it's certainly not going anywhere. And the implications for AI of actually having immutable understanding of the ownership of digital assets, which is just what crypto is no less profound than it was previously, even if we got caught up in pictures of monkeys and all that shit that was going on. How do you think about that world and the interaction with your world? What do you think we should understand?
I think crypto, Web3 more broadly is, I'm so bullish on the technology because I think there's just so much that you can do with decentralized networks and decentralized storage and decentralized permissions and decentralized logic. There are use cases you can enable that you can never enable in a centralized system. I think there's such an enormous potential there. I think the problem, well, this is sort of my being part of the crypto world for a decade and a half now, like thinking back on it. I think the problem, oh, sorry, not decade, maybe a decade, a little more than a decade. But
Enough.
my read on it is, I think Web3 technologies need to solve for, and this is an obvious statement, but need to solve for real world use cases rather than crypto use cases. And there are so many of these like Web3 technologies that solve for crypto use cases, and that it becomes people in crypto doing things with crypto that everyone gets excited about. And the way I think to break the cycle is really to build a successful business, and then for that business, enabling things that only crypto and Web3 can do for that business. So I still think about what are the ways in which decentralized information ownership in our context becomes a total unlock and invaluable. And there are use cases that we think, like, even in our space, are useful when information is not centralized. It's decentrally owned. But I think that's a discussion for another time, because I think there's a tech fascination, but not enough use case focus.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear how it manifests in what I know is a seriously interesting roadmap that you have at Epoch. We've gone to our final question that we ask all our guests on the fundamental molecule. What is the single most important piece of advice for future and aspiring water entrepreneurs?
I really do not like giving advice because everyone's journey is different. And I like to talk about what has worked for me. I think what's worked for me is, even with all the volatility and uncertainty, like, just thinking through first principles. Like, I know you talked about, like, my background with Egnyte, with Ripple. Like, I started in cloud storage, went to crypto and payments and market maker and asset manager and so on. And I think this, like, kind of wide range of exposures really got me into thinking through first principles. And I think that's served the company very well, because we were able to kind of deal with a lot of changes in the environment. I mean, there's something to be said about, like, specializing in one area and one technology and one market. And there are ways to build it that way. But I think in this time, for what we're going through right now, I've been very thankful for all these different variety of exposures that I've got that has forced me to think first principles.
That's a great answer. Start with what is true, typically and characteristically reflective. Jinal, thank you so much for being with us. We really can't wait to see what you go through the gears. You've put yourself in such a fascinating position with a truly, truly valuable platform, and we just feel privileged to be a part of it. Thank you so much for coming on the Fundamental Molecule.
Thank you for having me.